All right, good morning, everybody. Today is our last day of new material for the year. We're going to cover our last of the policy chapters today. It's foreign and military policy, and this will actually be very, very quick. Just covering probably 4 or 5 things that are potential AP test things that they talk about in this chapter. So tomorrow you will have a very short quiz. It will be one question, one extended response question from 17, 18, and 19 that you'll be asked to do, and then we'll have some time for review. So remember, your AP test is going to be on the 11th of May, which is 2 weeks from yesterday. So we've got less than 2 weeks now. So we're going to be spending some time doing some review materials this week. We're going to finish up the last of the required documents that we have not yet gone over, and then we'll do a little bit of review with the format of the argumentative essay that you're going to have to write for the test. Remember, this year's AP test is open note, open book. However, you still only have 25 minutes to write that first question, 15 minutes to write that second question. So if you go in with no real knowledge, thinking I'm just going to look everything up, they've set it up where it's not going to be Googleable. So it's something where you're going to have to interpret a graph, you're going to have to interpret a chart. If you're just trying to look everything up, you're not going to have time to finish. So you're going to have to make sure that you are as prepared as possible. They're also being very, very, very serious about plagiarism. So if two of you are working together and you're giving similar responses that they think are too similar to each other, then they're going to give you both basically a 0 and void your test. So this is something where I really want to stress that this is something that you need to make sure that you are prepared for, and that you need to make sure that you are taking seriously, and that you're not planning to just go in thinking, oh, I'm going to look everything up. That's not going to work. Okay, you're not going to get any credit for that. So I'll go over some stuff. You'll be ready with the review. I also want to point out on the Saturday before your test. So it's going to be Saturday morning on May 9th on C-SPAN, which is one of the networks that I'm sure you've never watched in your life. C-SPAN runs an hour-long thing called Cram for the Exam, where they have two guys who have written past versions of the test, kind of go over what they think is going to be on the test, some kind of things for you to remember going into the test. So that might be a good thing for you all to review. I'll remind you of that when you get a little bit closer, but that's going to be that 2 days before the test on May the 9th. We'll be out there. It's called Cram for the Exam. Okay. Let's look at Chapter 19. This is foreign and military policy. I'm going to skip over a few things here. Big thing with foreign policy is that the president is oftentimes given a lot of leeway in his role as commander-in-chief to kind of do more things that are unchecked by Congress as it relates to foreign policy than domestic policy. Congress oftentimes tries to check the president on just about everything they try to do in the United States, but foreign policy-wise, not as much. So even with that being said, there are struggles that the president faces in terms of getting foreign policy things accomplished. So even though the president is commander-in-chief and they control the military, Congress controls the budget. So if Congress doesn't want the United States to be in a certain place, they can just not fund whatever that thing is. And we'll talk about the War Powers Act here in a second, which really gives Congress more power to do that. But they control the budget, so that's kind of a key component here. While the president negotiates treaties, Congress has to ratify those. So this was a big deal back during World War I. Woodrow Wilson negotiated in the Treaty of Versailles that the United States would join the League of Nations. Came back to Congress, and Wilson was fighting with Congress, and Congress refused to ratify it. So we never did end up joining the League of Nations, which is part of the reason why that organization was as weak as it was, is that it didn't have the United States in it. So that's, again, something that the president and Congress have to kind of tag team there. Only Congress can regulate commerce with other nations, and only Congress can declare war. So it was during the Obama administration that Obama said that he wanted to normalize U.S. relationships with Cuba, open an embassy back up in Cuba, start to establish more direct ties to Cuba, and Congress said no. So even though the president wanted to do that, Congress stepped in and didn't allow him to do it. So that's the power that Congress has. With that being said, through executive order and some other things, the president oftentimes finds ways around some of the things that Congress may put in their way. So we've had 125 times in American history which American presidents have sent troops overseas somewhere. Only 11 times have we had declared wars against other countries, and only 5 of those declared wars had some sort of congressional declaration. We never declared war in Vietnam. Okay, so there are certain times in which the United States has never formally declared war. So even though these protocols are in the Constitution, we kind of sidestep those a lot of the time. Book talks about what's called the presidential box score. This is the idea that the president seems to get his way more often on foreign affairs issues than they do on domestic affairs issues, and the book gives you all sorts of different examples of that. You don't really need to know the examples as much as you need to know that the president does have a lot more control in foreign affairs than they do otherwise. With that being said, who leads the State Department is critical when it relates to foreign affairs. So the State Department, sometimes you get a president who can really push around their State Department, really dominant over the Secretary of State. Other times you get secretaries of state who have a lot of power over the president, particularly if you have inexperienced presidents and experienced politicians. You may have heard of the Marshall Plan last year in U.S. history. John Marshall was Secretary of State under Harry Truman. He had a lot of power during the Truman administration. Henry Kissinger had been a longtime Secretary of State under Richard Nixon. When Gerald Ford became president, he stayed in that post, and he really dictated pretty much all American foreign policy to Gerald Ford. Hillary Clinton had a lot more political experience than Barack Obama did, so she had a lot of pull on the State Department when she was Secretary of State. So oftentimes what you see is a good relationship there in which one of them has a little bit more experience than others. Now, other times you have a very confrontational relationship with your Secretary of State. And we kind of saw this with President Trump and his first Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, is that there was at first a fairly good relationship, and then that relationship became hostile between the two of them in terms of U.S. relationships with other countries. So sometimes if the president and the Secretary of State are not on the same page, that can cause problems. What we saw with President Trump was that the Secretary of State would go and have a meeting with a foreign country and think that the relationship was pretty good, and then the president would tweet something about them and made it seem like the relationship wasn't good, and that puts that Secretary of State kind of in a bind because they're the ones having to have the direct conversations with these foreign countries. Now, 1973, Congress passed what's known as the War Powers Act, and this is a significant piece of legislation that really was designed to kind of counteract some of the actions of Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon during Vietnam. Here's essentially what it says. The president can send troops overseas at any point that he chooses. So if President Trump today wanted to send troops anywhere in the world, he could do so. However, within 48 hours, he must introduce in writing to Congress where he sent them and why he sent them there. Now, Congress cannot immediately order them back if they don't like it. The president basically is going to have a 2-month window in which he can carry out kind of whatever he wants. Within 60 days, Congress has to do one of two things. They either have to declare war on the country where the president has sent troops, or they must issue authorization to allow those troops to stay there. So just basically give them permission to stay put wherever they're supposed to be. So let's say President Trump decides to send troops to, let's say, Ecuador, because there's a big outbreak of the coronavirus in Ecuador. And he could send troops there for 2 months. He's got to tell Congress within 2 days that he sent them there. He can send them there for 2 months. Within 60 days, though, Congress has to either declare war on Ecuador, which wouldn't make sense in this context, or they must give some sort of authorization for those troops to stay in Ecuador beyond those 60 days. If there's no authorization, the president must bring those troops home. Now, in order to bring those troops home, Congress has to pass what's called a concurrent resolution, where both the House and the Senate have to vote on it, bring the troops home right now, and the president cannot veto that concurrent resolution. So when this War Powers Act was passed, Richard Nixon tried to veto it. And the Supreme Court stepped in and said, well, the whole point of this is to check you, the president. Therefore, we're not going to allow you to veto the War Powers Act. We're not going to allow you to veto the concurrent resolution that would be there to bring troops home. Now, when Nixon vetoed the War Powers Act, Congress overrode that veto anyway, so it wouldn't have mattered. But this is in place to kind of put some checks on the president. Sorry about that. Some other things I want to talk about very briefly. Generally, during times of war, public opinion is very strongly on the side of the president. During World War II, Before the attack on Pearl Harbor, 94% of Americans thought we should stay out of the war. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the vote to basically declare war on Japan was 434 to 1 in the House and 100 to 0 in the Senate. So overwhelming support there. Vietnam, as the war went on, it became less and less popular. At the beginning, there was not widespread support for the war in Vietnam, but there was some support. As the war went on and dragged on and American troops started to lose their lives, that support was significantly less. So by the time we ended up pulling out of Vietnam, only 44% of people thought we should be there. So once public opinion starts to change, things respond. The Congress tends to respond accordingly. After September 11th, almost everybody voted for the Patriot Act. Almost everybody agreed to send troops to Afghanistan to try to hunt bin Laden and other things there. So generally, when there's any sort of attack on the United States or perceived attack, Congress usually unifies behind responses to that. All right, last big thing for this chapter are the 4 what we call worldviews, or how the United States should respond to different things that are happening around the world. So these are 4 you need to know. This could easily be an AP question. The first is called isolationism, and this is essentially our view after World War I. So after the U.S. got involved in the First World War, then things started to return to normal in the United States. Then we had World War II, or the beginnings of World War II, breaking out in Europe. And for a long time, we stayed out of it. We had a view that we should withdraw from world affairs. This wasn't our problem. Let somebody else deal with it. Now, over time, we started to provide weapons to the European countries who were our allies, things like that. But for a long time, we stayed out of it. And it wasn't until we were directly attacked at Pearl Harbor that we decided to really declare war in World War II and to really get involved. But for a long time, for 20 years, we kind of had this isolationist approach. These aren't our problems. We should stay out, and we should just kind of step back and let other people solve their problems there. Now, after World War II, we saw the beginning of the Cold War, and the U.S. shifted to a foreign policy view called containment. And this was the idea that we should resist the expansion of any sort of aggressive nation. Now, in this case, we're talking about the Soviet Union, but it really could be anybody. So if we practice containment today, it could be North Korea, it could be Iran, anything like that. So that would be the idea, that if you have an aggressive nation, you should seek to contain that nation. Now, after World War II, our mindset shifted. One of the people who took a lot of blame for what happened in World War II was a British Prime Minister by the name of Neville Chamberlain, and he did what was called appeasement of Adolf Hitler, where Hitler basically said, "We're going to take this land in Czechoslovakia, and if you let us have it, we won't do any more." And Chamberlain said, "Okay, you can just have it, and we will stay out of your business." Now, Hitler had no intention of holding to that deal. He just wanted to see how much he could push Chamberlain, and it worked. So after World War II, the United States changed their viewpoints. So no longer are we going to be isolationists. If anybody's being aggressive, we're going to stop them. And we kind of looked at ourselves almost as almost the world's police officer in terms of that. So in world history, you probably learned about the domino effect, or the domino theory, the idea that if one nation fell to communism, their neighbor might fall, things like that. This was really what the United States was trying to stop. This was the idea of containment. Then we get to Korea and Vietnam. And Korea was one thing. Then we get to Vietnam, which was a widely unpopular war. And after Vietnam, we kind of go back to this idea of disengagement. So in isolationism, or after World War I, the United States should not be involved in world affairs. Disengagement basically said that, okay, we shouldn't withdraw completely from world affairs, but we should avoid anything that doesn't directly benefit us. So obviously we were in Vietnam because we wanted to stop the spread of communism, but Vietnam wasn't on our back door. So if Vietnam had become communist, it wouldn't have been the end of the world for the United States. So the idea of disengagement is that let's stay out of things in which unless there's a direct tie to the United States. We need to avoid those kind of quagmire type wars where you just get bogged down and nobody's really winning or anything like that. And we kind of maintain that for a period of time. Now, where we have been recently is the idea of the United States playing the role of a human rights police officer in a way. The United States today tends to get involved in things happening in other countries when something bad is happening there. So if you have a leader that's killing their own people, like Saddam Hussein was doing to his people in Iraq, the United States intervened. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. The United States intervened. We had violence in Somalia. The United States intervened. So generally, if people are dying, particularly in large numbers, if there's genocides or things like that, the United States tends to get involved with those situations. And the goal is there to prevent another Hitler. We don't want it to ever get that far, where you have somebody who's able to get so much power built up over time. We want to kind of stop that before we get there. So the United States kind of plays that human rights role today. Now, there's a lot of debate over what our role in the world should be. Should we stay out of everybody's business? Should we only intervene with things that directly impact us? Or do you, like some people, think that because the United States economy is tied so closely to every other country in the world, everything that happens around the world impacts us? So that kind of authorizes us to get involved in anything. So there's a lot of different views on this. But these are the kind of the four big world views that people had as we moved through the 1900s. I always think this is interesting. The public's view of America as the world's leader, excuse me, and that percentage of people has changed over time. And today, people don't think it's as important that the United States be the leader of the world as they did at other times. If you look particularly in the 80s and 90s, it was viewed that the United States should be the leader of the world. That's sort of changing now. Kind of this world community of, if the United States works well with countries like Great Britain or Germany or things like that, then that should just be the way it is. Hey, last big idea I want to talk about is called the military-industrial complex, and this is really kind of goes back to this idea of interest groups and the bureaucracy. This is associated with President Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a general during the war. He becomes president in 1952, and then he serves for 8 years. So he had a lot of experience with the military. And in his farewell address, when he was leaving office in 1960, he warned against what he called the military-industrial complex. And basically what he was saying here is that interest groups have so much control today, and the military is so powerful today, that the military and interest groups can sometimes get the United States into things that maybe we don't have any business being in. And this relationship is so strong that sometimes Congress or even the president can get bullied by what the military wants to do and by what interest groups want to do. Now, Ronald Reagan was accused of this very heavily during the 1980s. The United States invaded the country of Grenada. Back in the 1980s, people wondered why the heck we were getting involved there. There was a big scandal in the 1980s called Iran-Contra, in which the United States was funneling weapons to rebels in Nicaragua, and people were saying, well, why the heck are we spending money on all of these weapons? And the United States in the 80s was building up this huge military arsenal against the Soviet Union, even though the Soviet Union was really starting to deteriorate in the 1980s. So we were building up this huge arsenal, and our enemy was depleting their arsenal just because they were basically winding down to the end of the Soviet Union. So there's a big accusation that the reason why the Reagan administration did this is the military had so much control over him, and interest groups were so powerful that they really could do whatever they wanted to. So Eisenhower warned against this, and people really believe that this is a thing because Eisenhower was a military guy, and he said, look, this relationship between the military and business leaders, interest groups, is so powerful today, and this is something that our country needs to worry about looking into the future. Talks a little bit about the war in Iraq, military budgets. Military basically gets whatever they want in terms of their budget. They can really basically ask for whatever they want, and they're probably going to get it. Okay, that is chapter 19. That's really all you essentially need to know for the AP test. So I'm just going to stop there. So tomorrow you'll get online. You'll have the one extended response question. That will be all you need to do on Wednesday. Please look for an email from Dr. Inkrot. It may have come yesterday. It may come today in terms of end of the year things. I believe your AP test is going to be on May the 11th. I believe that juniors are going to bring in their textbooks and iPads and everything and drop those off at the school on the 13th, except if you have additional AP tests. If you have additional AP tests you're taking after May 13th, there's going to be a separate AP drop-off date on May 22nd where they're going to be taking books and iPads. get everything back from you. But May 13th is going to be the standard day, so if this is the only AP test you're taking, or if you're not taking any AP tests, plan ahead for May the 13th. That's going to be the date in which juniors are going to be expected to bring all their stuff back up to the high school. Again, look for an email from Dr. Rankrod. He'll be sending all of that out with information about what you'll need to do and when you need to get things done. Okay, no writing prompt today. Please, if you did not go out there yesterday and give me your textbook number, please do that today. I need to make sure I have a complete, accurate list of what books you have. Also, if you know of books that are hiding anywhere in the school, if you're in DECA or if you're in band or ROTC and you took books with you, extra books over there, or if you have a book at home that's not yours, some of you grabbed a second book, please make sure I get a list of that. I need to be able to document where all of our textbooks are. If you have any questions about the quiz tomorrow, please email me, let me know. Otherwise, I will talk to you all again on Thursday. Have a good day.